I want to start with a question that I think most people have never had answered clearly. When someone says Alzheimer's is destroying the brain, what does that actually mean? What is physically happening at the cellular level that takes a sharp, capable, fully present person and gradually dims that presence over months and years? Most people have heard the broad strokes: plaques, tangles, memory loss, brain shrinkage, but there's a level of understanding deeper than that, one that explains not just what Alzheimer's does, but how it does it. And when you understand the mechanism, something important shifts. Because understanding how the disease actually works, what it disrupts, what it damages, and in what order, is the foundation for understanding what researchers are now targeting with new treatments. It's the foundation for understanding why certain lifestyle behaviors appear to protect the brain. And it's the foundation for having an informed conversation with your doctor about what you're seeing and what you're afraid of. Today, we're drawing from the National Institute on Aging's detailed research on what happens to the brain in Alzheimer's disease. This is not light reading, but I'm going to make it accessible, because the science here is genuinely fascinating, and buried inside it is a finding about how the brain loses its ability to use fuel, not just lose connections, that reframes how researchers think about both the disease and potential ways to slow it. Stay with me. This is worth understanding. Let's start with the healthy brain, because to understand what goes wrong in Alzheimer's, you first need a clear picture of what's going right in a brain that's working well. The human brain contains tens of billions of neurons, specialized cells whose entire purpose is to process and transmit information. Think of them as the electrical wiring of the brain's communication network. Each neuron has three basic components: a cell body at the center, branch-like structures called dendrites that receive incoming signals, and a long cable-like extension called an axon that sends signals outward. When neurons communicate, here's what actually happens. An incoming signal triggers an electrical charge that travels down the axon. At the end of the axon, chemical messengers called neurotransmitters are released across an incredibly small gap, called a synapse, between that neuron and the next one. Those chemical messengers bind to receptor sites on the receiving neuron, like a key fitting into a lock, and either stimulate or suppress activity in that next cell. Here's a number that puts the scale of this in perspective. The National Institute on Aging notes that a single neuron may have as many as 7,000 synaptic connections with other neurons. Multiply that by tens of billions of neurons, and you begin to appreciate the almost incomprehensible complexity of the brain's communication network. And it's the early loss of these synaptic connections, before neurons actually die, that is one of the first hallmarks of cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's. Neurons are also metabolically demanding. The brain consumes up to 20% of the energy used by the entire human body, despite being only about 2% of body weight. It runs primarily on glucose, delivered by an extraordinarily rich blood supply. When that blood supply is compromised, or when the brain's ability to use glucose efficiently is disrupted, neurons are among the first casualties. This detail matters. We'll come back to it. Now let's talk about what Alzheimer's actually does to this system. The disease disrupts three fundamental processes that neurons depend on: communication, metabolism, and their ability to repair and maintain themselves over time. It begins, usually, in specific regions of the brain. The earliest damage typically affects the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. These are the regions most essential to forming new memories, which is exactly why memory problems are typically one of the first noticeable signs of Alzheimer's. The disease isn't random in where it starts. It targets the memory system first. As the disease progresses, damage spreads to the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for language, reasoning, judgment, and social behavior. Eventually, widespread damage affects many regions of the brain, leading to the profound loss of function seen in advanced Alzheimer's. But understanding why neurons are damaged, the specific biological culprits, requires looking at two proteins in particular. And this is where the science gets genuinely specific in ways that are worth understanding. The first protein is called beta-amyloid. Beta-amyloid is naturally present in the brain, It's produced through the normal breakdown of a larger protein called the amyloid precursor protein. In small amounts and normal forms, it's part of ordinary brain chemistry. But in Alzheimer's disease, an abnormal form of beta-amyloid, specifically a version called beta-amyloid 42, which the NIA research describes as especially toxic, begins to accumulate in the spaces between neurons. These fragments clump together to form plaques, and these plaques disrupt the synaptic communication between neurons, the same connections we talked about earlier, the ones that allow brain cells to signal each other. Imagine the synapses as clear pathways between neurons. Now imagine plaque deposits accumulating in those pathways, not blocking them completely at first, but progressively gumming up the works. Communication becomes less efficient, signals don't transmit as cleanly, and over time, as the plaques accumulate and spread, the disruption becomes more severe. Researchers have been working for years on drugs that target beta-amyloid, and this is actually an area of genuine recent progress. 2 drugs, lecanemab and donanemab, have received full FDA approval for the treatment of early Alzheimer's. Both work by reducing amyloid plaques in the brain. Studies have shown that they can slow the progression of Alzheimer's-related cognitive decline in some people with early-stage disease. That's not a cure, but it is a meaningful development, a sign that targeting the underlying biology of the disease is possible and that the trajectory of drug development in this field is moving in a real direction. The second protein is called tau. Tau plays an essential role in healthy neurons. Inside each neuron, there are structures called microtubules. Think of them as internal scaffolding and transport rails that guide nutrients and essential molecules from the cell body to the axon and dendrites. Tau normally helps stabilize these microtubules, keeping the transport system running smoothly. In Alzheimer's disease, abnormal chemical changes cause tau to detach from the microtubules it's supposed to stabilize. Detached tau begins to stick to other tau molecules, forming threads, which eventually clump together to form what are called neurofibrillary tangles, dense, twisted accumulations inside neurons. These tangles block the neuron's internal transport system. Nutrients and essential molecules can't travel efficiently from the cell body to the axon and dendrites. Communication degrades, and eventually, the neuron is unable to function and dies. What the NIA research describes about the relationship between these 2 proteins is particularly important. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates first in brain regions involved in memory. Beta-amyloid builds up between neurons over time, and at a certain tipping point, when beta-amyloid reaches a critical level, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout much of the brain. In other words, these 2 proteins don't operate in isolation. Their interaction may be one of the key drivers of the disease's progression, and understanding that interaction is at the center of much current Alzheimer's research. Now let's talk about inflammation, because this is an area of Alzheimer's research that has grown significantly in recent years, and that connects directly to things that are within your influence. The brain has its own immune system, largely managed by a type of support cell called microglia. In a healthy brain, microglia patrol continuously, clearing away cellular debris, waste products, and protein buildups. They are the brain's cleanup crew. In Alzheimer's, microglia appear to malfunction. They fail to clear away beta-amyloid plaques and other debris effectively, and instead of protecting neurons, they release chemicals that cause chronic inflammation that compounds the damage already being done by plaques and tangles. Researchers are actively studying why microglia fail in Alzheimer's brains. One line of research focuses on a protein called TREM2, which is essential for proper microglial function. When TREM2 doesn't work correctly, the cleanup process breaks down, plaques accumulate, and the inflammatory cascade begins. Another type of support cell, called astrocytes, is also recruited to help clear the buildup. But in an Alzheimer's brain, both microglia and astrocytes appear to collect around affected neurons without effectively performing their protective function, and the chemicals they release in the process add another layer of damage. This is why doctors rarely explain this clearly. Alzheimer's is not simply a disease of plaques and tangles. It is a disease of multiple interacting processes, communication failure, metabolic disruption, transport breakdown, and chronic inflammation, all occurring simultaneously and reinforcing each other. Understanding this is both humbling in its complexity and clarifying in its implications, because it suggests that protecting brain health requires addressing multiple systems, not just one. We're now at the part of today's video that I want you to stay for. This is the finding I mentioned at the beginning, the one that I believe changes how you think about the relationship between your daily choices and your long-term brain health. It involves glucose metabolism. The NIA research is specific. In people with Alzheimer's, there is a measurable reduction in glucose entering the brain and a decrease in the brain's ability to produce energy from that glucose. Given that the brain consumes up to 20% of the body's total energy supply, running almost entirely on glucose, this metabolic disruption is not a minor side effect of the disease. It is one of its central features. And here's why this matters beyond the biology of the disease itself. The blood vessels that supply glucose and oxygen to brain tissue can be damaged by the same conditions that damage blood vessels throughout the body: high blood pressure, diabetes, atherosclerosis, and the metabolic changes associated with obesity and inactivity. When those vessels are damaged, glucose delivery to brain tissue is compromised. And when glucose delivery is compromised, neurons are under energy stress. The NIA research explicitly identifies vascular problems as contributors to Alzheimer's pathology. Cardiovascular conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke can damage brain blood vessels, reduce blood flow, and, critically, disrupt the blood-brain barrier, a protective filtering system that normally keeps harmful substances out of the brain while allowing in the glucose and nutrients neurons need. Recent studies have highlighted the connection between glucose metabolism in the brain and multiple aspects of Alzheimer's, including differences in how the disease manifests and progresses. Researchers are actively exploring interventions that target this glucose metabolism pathway. And here is the practical connection I want you to hold clearly: managing blood sugar, managing blood pressure, staying physically active, which improves both cardiovascular health and the brain's efficiency at using glucose. Avoiding smoking, which damages blood vessel walls. These are not just heart health strategies, they are brain metabolic health strategies. They influence the conditions under which your neurons receive the fuel they need to function. This is why the lifestyle recommendations that appear throughout Alzheimer's research are not generic health advice tacked onto the disease story. They are targeted at the specific biological vulnerabilities that the science has identified. Let's also spend a moment on an important and encouraging aspect of healthy neuron biology, because it offers real context for why brain health habits matter. Unlike most cells in the body, neurons are built to last a very long time. Many of them function throughout a person's entire life, and to support that longevity, neurons are constantly maintaining and repairing themselves, adjusting their synaptic connections based on stimulation, strengthening connections that are used frequently, and building new connections when the brain learns something new. The NIA research notes that adult brains may even generate new neurons, a process called neurogenesis, particularly in regions involved in memory and learning. In people with Alzheimer's, there is evidence suggesting this neurogenesis is decreased. But in a healthy aging brain, this capacity for renewal and adaptation is real and ongoing. Mental stimulation, physical activity, social engagement. The research on all of these connects partly to this capacity for neural remodeling. When you challenge your brain, use your memory, learn something new, stay socially engaged, you are stimulating the kind of synaptic activity that supports this ongoing remodeling process. You are, in a very real biological sense, using the brain's own repair mechanisms. That is not a metaphor. It is a description of what is actually happening at the cellular level when you engage in cognitively demanding activity. Let's bring everything together with 5 practical actions rooted in what the biology actually tells us. The first is to protect your brain's blood supply by managing cardiovascular health as a direct brain priority. Blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol. These numbers are not just heart metrics. They determine the quality of the blood flow reaching your brain's neurons. Work with your doctor to keep them in healthy ranges. That conversation has direct relevance to your long-term cognitive function. The second is to stay physically active consistently. Exercise improves blood flow to the brain, supports glucose metabolism in brain tissue, and may stimulate neurogenesis and synaptic remodeling. The brain research on physical activity is among the most consistent in the entire field of aging science. Approximately 150 minutes of moderate movement per week is the established target. Walking counts. It adds up. The third is to treat chronic inflammation as a brain health concern. Smoking, poor sleep, unmanaged metabolic conditions, and sustained psychological stress all promote systemic inflammation. And the research on Alzheimer's suggests chronic inflammation in the brain is one of the disease's key drivers. Choices that reduce inflammation, not smoking, adequate sleep, stress management, an anti-inflammatory diet, support the glial cells that are supposed to be protecting your neurons. The fourth is to keep your brain's communication networks actively engaged. Mental stimulation, learning new things, engaging in cognitively challenging activities, maintaining social relationships that require active communication, appears to support the synaptic connections and neural networks that are among the first targets of Alzheimer's damage. Use those connections. Challenge them. The research suggests the brain responds to demand. And the fifth is to ask your doctor specifically about the new Alzheimer's treatments if you or someone you love has been diagnosed with early-stage disease. The FDA approval of lecanemab and donanemab represents genuine progress, the first drugs that target the underlying biology of Alzheimer's rather than just managing symptoms. They are not appropriate for everyone, and they carry their own considerations and risks. But they exist. And knowing they exist, and having an informed conversation with a neurologist about whether they're relevant to your situation, is part of being an active participant in your own healthcare. Here's what I want you to carry with you from today. Alzheimer's is a complex multi-system disease. It involves the disruption of neural communication through amyloid plaques, the collapse of internal neuron transport through tau tangles, a metabolic crisis in how the brain receives and uses glucose, chronic inflammation driven by malfunctioning support cells, and the progressive regional spread of damage from the memory system outward. That complexity is real, and it's humbling. But within that complexity is a picture that is not entirely beyond influence. The vascular pathways that determine glucose delivery to neurons are shaped by the same lifestyle factors that shape cardiovascular health. The inflammatory environment in the brain is influenced by sleep, metabolic health, and whether we smoke. The synaptic networks that are among the earliest targets of the disease are maintained and strengthened by cognitive engagement and physical activity. Understanding the biology doesn't just satisfy intellectual curiosity, it tells you where the leverage points are. It tells you why the lifestyle recommendations that researchers make aren't arbitrary. They map directly onto the specific biological vulnerabilities that the disease exploits. Your brain is a biological system running 20% of your body's total energy on tens of billions of interconnected cells. It is extraordinary, it is resilient, and it responds, for better and for worse, to the conditions you create for it. Create good conditions, every day. That is both the simplest and the most important instruction the science offers. And you have far more capacity to do that than most people have ever been clearly told. Before you go, here's something I want to plant in your mind for our next conversation. We've explored the biology of Alzheimer's in real depth today. What happens to neurons, how plaques and tangles develop, how the brain loses its metabolic footing. But there's an aspect of brain health and aging that connects to Alzheimer's in ways that are only beginning to be fully mapped by researchers. It involves the relationship between hearing loss and cognitive decline. Studies have found a significant association between untreated hearing loss and increased dementia risk. And the proposed mechanisms involve some of the same neural communication pathways we discussed today. It's a connection that most people have never heard explained, and that has real practical implications for how seriously older adults should take hearing health. That's coming up next. And if you want to be there for it, if you want to keep building a clear, honest, science-based understanding of what protects your brain and your independence as you age, subscribe to this channel. Take good care of yourself. Your brain built everything you are. It's worth understanding and protecting deeply.